Thank you. Thank you for coming this evening. I'd like to begin my reflections this evening with a short digression, or rather, I'd like to tell you a little story, a true story, that has been rattling around my head ever since it happened. And I think it very appropriately fits in with the second week of the spiritual exercise. A couple of months back, one of my fellow Jesuits asked me to drive with him to attend the funeral of a family friend. I agreed, and we set off for Southwest Louisiana. After the funeral, I suggested that we continue on to Opelousas to visit Father Donald Hawkins, of happy memory, who was in hospice care and not expected to live very long. We arrived at his room and we found him unconscious and heavily sedated. I'm not sure what I expected to find, but this wasn't it. So I commented to my traveling companion that I thought that he would be conscious, but in his present condition, he couldn't last long. My companion, probably quite correctly, shushed me. Shh, he says, he might be able to hear. I replied something to the effect that he was so loaded with morphine that he wouldn't be able to hear anything. With a scowl on his face, my friend rushed to the bedside, and of course, being afflicted with a Gallic temperament, began to speak to Donald, telling him that we appreciated all his good work that he had done for the church, that he was a good Jesuit, and that we loved him. And then he bent down and kissed him on the forehead. Immediately, my companion swirled his head around toward me with such speed and vehemence that I thought of the scene from The Exorcist, where the girl sweeps around and confronts the visiting priest. Well, he says, aren't you going to kiss him goodbye? Now, given my more reserved Teutonic temperament, I retorted without reflection and perhaps without sufficient charity. No, I said, we don't have that kind of relationship. I walked over to the bed, placed my palm on Donald's forehead and said a prayer, offered a blessing, and made the sign of the cross on his forehead. Afterwards, we left quietly, and 3 days later, Donald went to his heavenly home. Now, it strikes me that my little vignette raises precisely the question that Ignatius seeks to raise in the second week of the exercises, and more broadly in the exercises as a whole. What kind of a relationship do you have? Or more exactly, what kind of a relationship do you have with the triune God, our Lord? Ignatius was very big on relationships. There's no indication from any of the usual sources that he was anything but a normal, gregarious man who enjoyed the company of others. In fact, we know that he was occasionally in trouble with officials for carousing with his friends. And later, his impulse to gather others to join him in his efforts to minister and preach show a man who finds himself very comfortable with people. So to think of Ignatius as a loner, sitting alone in the cave in Manresa, praying and writing down his spiritual reflections, is really a distortion. He did indeed sit, pray, and write down his reflections while waiting for the plague to lift in Barcelona so he could continue on his journey to Rome and ultimately Jerusalem, his final goal. But we distort his personality and the nature of the exercises themselves if we limit them only to the 10 months he spent in Manresa by the river Cardener. As important as this time was for Ignatius and for the development of his spirituality, it does not contain the full fleshed out dimensions of his mature reflection. He tells us that he continued to work on the exercises, changing, altering, and perfecting their written form. And so over time, Ignatius incorporated new insights based on his experience of God. But his fundamental insight now was set. God, he knew, was moving his soul. Through an experience of consolation and desolation, he felt the call of God to a life of greater faith and intimacy. And he never lost confidence in this fundamental reality. God, the good and loving Father, is communicating with those whose hearts are open to hearing his voice. God has created all that is good and holy in this world, and all of creation and all the world's creatures will come back to their source, to God. This is the heart of the principle and foundation that is found at the beginning of the exercises. Ignatius offers this rather short statement as a consideration, one that we are to make our own. For Ignatius, it was the starting point of both his spiritual and philosophical reflections. A man or a woman who enters the first week of the exercises should be ready to pray more methodically and yet more freely, according to Ignatius, with deeper contrition, but also with more wonder at the mercy of God, with experiences of recoil, desolation, and attraction, consolation. Consequently, the man or woman entering into prayer of the first week ought to be able to see the paradox, the great Christian irony, that without sin, we would never know the mercy of God. In the first week of the exercises, Ignatius invites us to consider sin, not as an abstraction, but as a concrete and personal rebellion against a loving God. He offers reflections upon this history of sin, the reflection of the God's loving invitation to a deeper personal relationship that has been rejected by humanity. Through disobedience, sin enters the world. By considering the sin of the angels, Adam and Eve, and our own place in the history of sin, we experience remorse for having turned from God's love and recognize this as the greatest of spiritual crimes, the choice of oneself and the rejection of a loving relationship with God, a rejection that leads to death, and in Ignatius' terms, to hell itself. Now, Ignatius knew firsthand what it was to be trapped by sin. He led a rather ordinary, inordinate life of a young man of his age. Recent scholarship has even suggested that he had had an illegitimate daughter by a woman who was a servant at the castle where he had served as a young page. But sin was not inevitable. It was God who established and called us to this new relationship that overcome the limitations of sin. Ignatius experienced that for himself. He experienced being freed from the burdens of sin. He had sinned, but God forgives. And God called him to be one with the divine mystery. How else can one respond but with a profound sense of gratitude? In one of his later writings, he says that there is no greater sin than ingratitude. I have no doubt that he meant that quite literally. He found himself in deep despair because of his former life, but he also came to believe that he now had even greater reason to be grateful to the merciful God. Having experienced himself as loved and forgiven by God, Ignatius maintains that we, as he himself was, should be overwhelmed by gratitude. For only hearts filled with gratitude have the capacity to answer God's invitation. But we are not always free to choose even God. To win that freedom, to win the freedom to choose God, requires God's grace. And in order to do God's will and fulfill God's purpose, Ignatius saw the considerations of the second week of the exercise exceedingly important. In many respects, that is the heart of the second week. To choose God's will, to serve God's purpose. And in a broader sense, it's the purpose of the exercises in general. In the second week, Ignatius offers the grateful sinner a series of prayers and reflections that frees the heart so that one can choose to follow God's will. Ignatius proposes that we focus on the life of Jesus, the suffering and obedient servant, and ultimately to join him in service to the Father. That is, after all, the ultimate goal, to join with Christ in his relationship with the Father. Running through the entire second week is a contemplation of Jesus as presented in the Gospels, beginning with his incarnation, his birth, his hidden life, then traversing his public life. The order is chronological, but somewhat looser because of the abundant material offered by Ignatius. The director and the directee are to choose the more profitable biblical passages for reflection as prayer, and as the Spirit so moves the directee. Depending on the stage and condition of one's life, the choice to serve God in His church might involve a radical commitment, joining a religious community, or taking private vows. But for most, it would lead to strengthening one's dedication to live by Christian values. In the second week, one becomes a follower of Christ. One hears His message, witnesses His healing, and seeks to establish a deeper attachment to the person of Christ. Both Jerry Fagan and Howard Gray, two of our most knowledgeable Ignatian scholars, summarize this goal of this week by quoting the musical Godspell: to see Jesus more clearly, love Him more dearly, and follow Him more nearly day by day. In this second week, Ignatius offers us then the opportunity to follow Christ. And he wants to do so in a way that will allow us to experience Christ in the most intimate fashion. He has these exercises, which I must clearly admit, when I've done, I have been a complete failure at. And the exercises are basically to place yourself in the exact situation as one of the disciples. And as one of the disciples, to hear what Jesus is saying, to feel the grass, to smell the air, to touch, to become intimately involved with the environment. Now, every time I tried that when I was a novitiate, and later on as I made the exercises for a second time during my tertianship, I never could hold more than one thought in my head at a time. I could smell, but then I couldn't see. I could see, but then I couldn't smell. I could hear, but then I couldn't see. It was a very difficult process. But I could never quite understand what Ignatius was getting at, why this emphasis on feeling with all our senses. And then last summer, we sponsored a tour, a group tour, an Ignatian tour of the Ignatian sites. Father Ted Desiak and myself went along as the Jesuit sponsors, so to speak. And we went to all of the sites, traced them through Spain that Ignatius had visited. And this time, as I did so, we saw the places. We touched the stones. We saw his house. We looked at the fireplace. We saw the tables. And for the first time, I truly experienced in a way that I had never done during the spiritual exercises made in the most formal manner, what it meant to be intimate with Ignatius. I learned more about Ignatius, and Father Desiak said the same thing, than he had previously done from his spiritual exercises, trying to think and trying to remember. It is that kind of intimacy, though, what Ignatius was trying to get at. He wanted us to feel and to experience the presence of Christ so that we could develop a true relationship with Christ. And in doing so, He wanted us to follow the pattern of Christ, to follow Christ from His birth through His ministry. And in doing so, not only becoming intimate with the message of Christ, but becoming intimate with the man himself. This was the call of the discipleship. This discipleship that we are all to have as Christians, to be one with Christ so that we could be one with the Father, is what Ignatius was attempting to do in this second week. But he knew from his own experience that being trapped, being less than free, was the reality of most people involved. And so interspersed with these considerations of Christ's ministry, His healing, we have other considerations presented as well. He offers perhaps the most memorable of these considerations of the two standards. And he paints a picture for the person who is experiencing the exercises of two great armies on a great field. And of course for Ignatius this was something that he greatly appreciated. He was a failed knight, and therefore this imagery spoke a great deal to him. Two great armies, the army of the world and Satan on one side, and the army of Christ and the divine army on the other. Now he wasn't seeking here a clash of arms, but he did see a clash of ideas, a struggle between the choices we make in life that lead to Christ and the choices that lead away from Christ. And having identified so intimately with Christ, by experiencing Christ, by witnessing His miracles, by touching Christ as He touched others, we are then capable, free enough to start making those choices, to choose Christ over the world's riches, over power, over all of the attractions that pull us away from seeking God, that pull us away from a divine relationship. He also talks about what he calls the three classes of men. The three classes of men is he wanted us to have greater generosity. For him, there was no growth, no spiritual growth possible without a generous heart that is opened up because of our recognition that we have been saved, by God's love. As sinners, we have yet been saved. And so he wants the response of gratitude, but he asks us what kind of gratitude do we ultimately have? And so he presents three classes of men. He uses money, a monetary characteristic. Someone has now given you a pot of money, and with this money, you find yourself in a difficult situation. You feel the desire to give it to the poor, to shed the burden of this financial money by doing good. And you know that having the money is actually probably injurious. You're spending it on your bad habits. And so you look at this money and you say, boy, I really would like to do something good with it. And that's as far as it goes. You never get past, I really would